By now, most of you know, and I hope that you saw kind of our theme, at least this morning, really focused on Christ's love, the Father's love for us, Christ's love for us for dying on the cross. And it is the season of Lent, and it is a season of preparation. Anybody know how many days the season of Lent is? 40. And if you try to count them, you're going to go, well, I'm counting from last Ash Wednesday to Easter, and there's 46. Well, 40 days of fasting and prayer does not include the Sundays. So if you're fasting and praying, especially if you're fasting, you should pray every day. But if you're fasting, from Ash Wednesday to Easter Sunday, you get Sundays off. So you can eat as much as you want to on Sunday. But this is a season of preparation. Its sister season is Advent. You know, we talk about Advent in preparing our hearts for the arrival of Jesus. We do that during Advent. At Lent, we take these 40 days to prepare our hearts for Easter, when we celebrate just a wonderful celebration. So it's a time of reflection. It's a time of renewal. Those of you who were here on Wednesday night, we had a wonderfully powerful, I'll talk about that a little bit more in a little bit. But Easter is a time of celebration, much like Christmas is. And we often think of Christmas being just one day, don't we? Well, we know that Christmas is 12 days. Would you believe if I told you that Easter lasts for 50 days? It does. From Easter all the way to Pentecost is the season of Easter, and we celebrate his resurrection. But I suppose I digress. I digress a little bit. Like fast, pray, give. Those are the three things that we really want to do during Lent. And as I prayed about and I sought the Lord about what to preach during this season of preparation, I really felt the Lord leading me toward the topic of worship. What is worship? How do we worship? What are some of the ways we worship? What can distract us in worship? What are the means of grace? What makes something a sacrament? Because I tell you what, for most of the church, whether it be a little country church out in McCray Brook Valley or for a big mega church, a lot of people, when they think of the word worship, simply think about the music. But the worship, when we worship, for one, and I didn't even get into this in my notes, worship is a lifestyle. Worship is how we glorify God all of the time. And when we come to worship corporately, from the moment we step up to the platform to the moment we leave, that is all corporate worship. It's not just the songs. And so I feel like I can probably do just a little bit in my little corner of the world that God has called me to lead, to look at this idea of worship. And in order to introduce us to the subject, let's turn our attention to the Gospel of John. We're going to be in the Gospel of John, chapter 4, and we're going to look at a story that could be familiar to you. This morning, we're going to look at the story of Jesus and the woman at the well. Here's how the story goes. I'm going to paraphrase the front half so that we can get to the part that we're looking at today. And you'll remember that Jesus and his disciples were in the Jerusalem area, and they were heading up to Galilee. And in most cases, if a Jewish person was going from Jerusalem to Galilee, they would cross over the Jordan River, go up the east bank of the Jordan, cross back over when they got up to Galilee, and then go to Galilee. Why would they avoid the West Bank? Now, we hear a lot about the West Bank of Israel, do we not? Well, the West Bank is where the Samaritans lived. And the Jewish people thought that the Samaritans were half-breeds. They weren't really worth anything. And so what they would do is they would deliberately go out of their way to cross over the Jordan River twice so that they could avoid going to Samaria. John tells us that Jesus had to go to Samaria. So Jesus and his disciples, they go to Samaria, and they stop in a little village called Sychar, and they're at the well. They're at Jacob's well. This is a well that their ancestor Jacob, the Jacob that we know of in the Bible, had dug. And Jesus is sitting there by the well, and he tells the disciples, hey, I need you to go into town and get some food and drink. We're famished out here in the desert. And so the disciples go off into the village. And while Jesus is sitting there at the well, a woman comes out. He immediately knows something about this woman just because she's coming out in the middle of the day, in the heat of the day. Most of us know what it's like to be out in the heat of the day here in Eldred in the summertime. We can't really get a feel for that. Even my friend, I had some friends who went to Florida for the last couple weeks. It's been cold down there, even for New Yorkers. So I can only imagine what the natives felt like. But think about going out into the heat of the day, in the desert, to the well, because she did not want to have a conversation with anybody. She was not, this woman was rejected by her community. And so she comes out and she sits down, and Jesus starts having a conversation with her, and she's like, wow, this is weird. For one, he was a male, she was a female. 2, he was a rabbi, she was not his disciple. And she was a Samaritan, he was a Jew. This was completely out of the thing. But Jesus starts and he asks the question, can you give me a drink? And the conversation eventually moves to this topic of worship. And it's where we find ourselves today. Could you all please stand as we read the Gospel of John this morning? Sir, the woman said, you must be a prophet. So tell me, why is it that you Jews insist that Jerusalem is the only place of worship, while we Samaritans claim that it is here at Mount Gerizim, where our ancestors worship? Jesus replied, believe me, dear woman, the time is coming when it will no longer matter whether you worship the Father on this mountain or in Jerusalem. You Samaritans know very little about the one you worship, while we Jews know all about him, for salvation comes to the Jews. But the time is coming, indeed it's here now, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. The Father is looking for those who will worship him that way. For God is spirit, and so those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. You may be seated. But the time is coming when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For God is spirit, and so those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. So the first thing we want to take a look at is this question is, what is worship? What is worship? I said that most people would define worship as being the music portion of the worship service. Oh, didn't we play some good worship music today? And they get all caught up in the emotion. Or we have all kinds of ideas about what worship is. But worship, the word worship comes from the Old English word. I wish it were just a little darker, but it's worthskype. And then the English turns it into worthship, which is where we get the word worship. And to worship something is to acknowledge its worth. Now, I told Pastor Pam that even if no kids showed up this morning, I wanted her to do that lesson because it applied so much to what we were going to look at this morning. Because the first commandment is that we should worship God and worship God only. And I think most of us are quite aware, and Pam reminded us of that people give all kinds of worth to things that are not God. We give worth to time, we give worth to money, we give worth to sports, we give worth to possessions, we give worth to fame. It was interesting because she was talking about a story, and I couldn't remember what exactly she was talking about. And yeah, there was an American pastor who was in his den with this Indian pastor, and they came in to his den, and there were all these trophies. There was all this sports memorabilia. And the pastor and the Indian pastor was like, wow, do you guys worship sports? Do you guys worship trophies? How? How? And we do. We worship all kinds of things that and we place, that these things take a higher value than God. And we are reminded that anytime we give something a higher value than God, it is what? It is an idol. Which not only breaks the first commandment, that we shouldn't worship anything other than God, but it breaks the second commandment, which says that we shouldn't make an idol out of anything. And it's tough, I know, but Jesus tells us that true worshipers worship in spirit and in truth. And so we already know that when we worship, we acknowledge that God has worth. So let me take you on a little rabbit trail. Not a long rabbit trail, but it's a planned rabbit trail, so it's all right. Some of you know that I have a blog. Some of you are like, what in the world is a blog? Well, a blog is somewhat of an online journal, and you can find it if you type in www.daleargott.com. You will go to my blog, and it's an online journal of sorts, and it started way back in 2006. I can't believe that I've had an online journal for, 14 years. Long after many people's blogs have come and gone, mine's still going. Believe it or not, I still put stuff up there, which is interesting. And back in 2006, I went to Flame as a volunteer. Flame was a conference designed for people who have already had their 4-year degree in something. Mine was in church music, and other people would come in with business degrees. But for people who were beyond the traditional college years, who felt the call of God, who wanted to be ordained. And so Flame was this vehicle by which the Wesleyan Church ordained men and women who were beyond the traditional age, who really felt the call of God in their life and wanted to be ordained. So I went through Flame, Pam went through Flame. I started in 1998 and graduated from Flame in 2005. During my time at Flame, many times as a student, I would lead the musical worship in the morning. We would have chapel, and I would lead the musical worship. And one of the things that I really felt strongly about is that when I graduated, one of the things I wanted to do was give back. And so, starting in 2006 in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, I attended my first Flame as a volunteer and volunteer worship leader, and it was great. I got to see Flame from another side of the thing, and I helped with dinner and led the musical worship. And a friend of mine, Mark Wilson, we were good friends, and he was a professor at Flame. At the time, he was pastoring the Hayward Wesleyan Church in Wisconsin, Hayward, Wisconsin, a town of 3,000 people, and the church was 600. Yeah, that was pretty amazing when I thought about that. And he had been blogging for several years, and he encouraged me to try it. So I started, and I originally called it Virginia Transplant because we were transplants to Southern Virginia. I mean, we were in the deep South, Virginia, and it's a completely different animal than any place you've ever been. And so I blogged about our time there, and then eventually I changed it to Reflections from the South Side, and eventually God called us to move up to Stanton, Virginia, for me to lead worship at a church. And for a while I called it Transitions because we spent over a year in transition between the Virginia parsonage in Martinsville, and they didn't have a place for us to live when we first moved to Stanton, so we moved into another Wesleyan Church's parsonage, and finally they built us a brand new house. And so finally, when we moved to our new house and we finally got settled in, I decided on this idea of worshiping in spirit and truth, and that's the name that has remained. And that part of that inspiration for that name came from the fact that another pastor friend of mine who had listed me on his blog, behind my name as a link, it said worshiper. Now Chris is a very serious, deep thinker, and he's a serious theologian, and that had a big impact on me. That Chris thought that Chris said that I was a really serious thinker about the thought of worship. And I thought that was really cool, and I believe it's something that I've always been called to do. God has called me, even more than being your pastor and preacher, God has called me to be a worshiper, and God has called me to lead his people in worship. And my blog has always had a heavy focus on worship, and that's just the way it is. And we're gonna, and one of the things I want you to know is that each one of us are called to be worshipers. Not just the pastor. The pastor, many times I just called myself the lead worshiper, you know. That's what God has called me to do, is to lead people in worship. And even now I consider myself much more of a worshiper than a preacher. Even now as I'm giving us God's word, I feel like we're in a moment of worship. And so I don't consider myself so much a preacher, but a worshiper. And it's not just the music. Like I said, I love the fact that Pastor Pam has been leading us in prayer over the last couple months. And we're going to get to why we've changed some things around in just a moment. But for example, if you missed the Ash Wednesday service, Wednesday night, you missed a powerful service of worship. I mean, it was incredible. And, you know, we sang a couple songs. We did sing a couple songs. But it wasn't about the music. It was about, and if you weren't here, it's a very service with lots of responsive readings and lots of reading that we do, written prayers and all that. But it was powerful. And one of my favorite parts of the Ash Wednesday service was when we put up on the screen, we put up Psalm 51. And we read Psalm 51, and we read David's confession together. It was powerful. And then I'll never forget that night as we took the ashes and I put a cross on each person's hand. It was just powerful as I gripped the hand of the person who came up and said, "You are dust, and to dust you shall return. Repent and be faithful to the good news of Jesus Christ." Powerful, powerful moment. It had nothing to do with singing. I love creating worship experiences for God's children. This past winter, during Christmas, we had our Christmas Eve service, and I was sick all day, and we got here, and just nothing went the way I wanted it to that night. I was so embarrassed. I'm like, this is just awful, because it just felt like it was just like all thrown together. It was just a mishmash. I'm like, this is not the way I like to lead worship. But I love to create a worship experience for God's children, especially when it points us to the one who is worthy of all worship. And so we've looked at the fact that God, through his son Jesus, has called his children to worship. But how are we to worship? Well, there's all kinds of answers, but the one I'm looking for that comes from our text this morning. That we, true worshipers, are to worship him in spirit and in truth. If you capture nothing else this morning, worship is when we worship God in spirit and in truth. We're going to go to the truth part and then come back to the spirit. The truth revolves around who God is. Jesus himself expressed that he was the way, the truth, and the life. To worship God in truth means to acknowledge God for who he is. To acknowledge Jesus for who he is. To acknowledge the Holy Spirit for who he is. And there is a real danger in churches of all stripes, not just Catholic churches or Protestant churches or evangelical churches or little country chapels or big city churches or contemporary churches or traditional churches. There is a real danger, instead of worshiping in truth, meaning that we're acknowledging that God is God, there's a danger in worshiping God with our feelings. And we need to be really careful about that, because feelings are almost the exact opposite of truth. I want to be very careful, because we are emotional people. I've said that over the last couple weeks. We are absolutely emotional people. And I know that each one of us is different. I think you guys know me enough that when I get really excited, you know it. That's just who I am. I get really excited. My emotions, I can ride the highest roller coaster with my emotions, and I can dip down to the lowest sea with my emotions. I can be all over the map. That's why it's dangerous to worship with our emotions and with our feelings. That's why it's much more important to worship God in truth. And we need to be careful, because there are some people who don't show emotion when they worship. And that's okay, because that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with them. It means they just don't show emotion. But one of the things I want to really say here is worshiping in truth versus worshiping with our emotions and our feelings, because they will lead us astray. When I pick songs for worship, this morning as I picked songs for worship, I was very conscious of the direction I wanted to go this morning. I was very conscious that I wanted to talk about Jesus' sacrifice for us, how we are, and that's why we sang that great hymn, and can it be that I should gain? Have you ever thought about that first line? And can it be that I should gain an interest in the Father's love? That God loved you and me so much that He would care about us. Sinners, saved by grace. That's an amazing line to me. And so I'm very, very conscious, very intentional about picking the songs that go together. And really, one of the things that I tend to do when I pick songs for worship is that I pick songs that just aren't songs about feelings about God, but I would much rather sing songs that sing of the attributes of God. One of my new favorites, and I can tell that you enjoy singing it as well, is "Oh Praise the Name." Oh, praise the name of the Lord our God. Oh, praise His name forevermore. For endless days we will sing your praise, oh Lord, our Lord our God. Because the story tells the story of Jesus. I cast my mind to Calvary, where Jesus died upon the tree. Yeah, it's important to sing songs of God's attributes. And so, to worship in truth means to acknowledge God for who He is, His attributes, His work, His salvation. Now, what does it mean to worship in spirit? Are we talking about our spirit? Or are we talking about God's spirit? Well, it's not either or, it's both and. For those who are new creatures in Christ, our spirit owes its existence and vibrancy to the Spirit of God. John Piper writes, "True worship comes only from spirits made alive and sensitive by the quickening of the Spirit of God." God's Spirit ignites and energizes our spirit. Christian worship engages both the heart and the head. You know, there's a lot of people who worship with just heart. But that can get us into dangerous territory. There's a lot of people who worship with just the head. And guess what? That can get us into dangerous territory. I love what John Piper again writes. He says, "Worship must be vital and real in the heart, and worship must rest on a true perception of God. There must be spirit and there must be truth. Truth without emotion produces dead orthodoxy, and a church full or half full of artificial admirers. On the other hand, emotion without truth produces an empty frenzy and cultivates shallow people who refuse the discipline of rigorous thought. But true worship comes from people who are deeply emotional, who love deep and sound doctrine. Strong affections for God, rooted in truth, are the bone and marrow of biblical worship." So what I want to say is this morning is that in our worship must always be rooted in spirit and in truth. We can get off into some very strange territory when we begin rooting our worship in our feelings. There are people who like to come to worship on Sunday because it makes them feel good. I hope none of you are somebody who just comes to Sunday worship just to make you feel good. You know, They have clubs for that. I'm glad you laughed at that. You know, there are some who come to Sunday just to sing songs that make them feel good. They testify to what God has done based on their feelings. And this can be very dangerous. I'm about to show you a video. It's by Alistair Begg. And I've shown it to our prayer partners on Wednesday night. And I've also shown it to our board. But I thought it's a great reminder that we need, that worship of our God is a very serious thing. It reminds us that worship is about what we know, spirit and truth, and not about our feelings.
Verse 1 of chapter 5, now we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven not built by human hands. We know. The Christian faith engages our minds. This is something that we have to keep reminding ourselves of so that we don't allow our minds to fossilize and that we continue to be sharpened and to make progress. I was at a church in California just a few weeks ago now, back in August, I think it was, time flies. And I went there, I had a Sunday free, and I was staying with friends, and I went down to the church, and I was excited because I get to go now, and I don't have to do anything at all except do whatever they tell me to do. And so I sat there and I waited for it to begin. And it was quite fascinating, actually. They had big screens, and they had a clock on the screens. And when I got in, it said 5 minutes. And I'd only been in about 2 seconds, and you won't be surprised, it said 4 minutes and 58 seconds. And then it counted down, and eventually when it counted down, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, and just right on the moment of time, the band began, and I was waiting for David Letterman at that point. Anybody, I didn't know what was going to happen next. And then eventually the band did what it did, and then the person who was to lead the praise, his opening gambit was this. Hey, how do y'all feel this morning? Well, that was enough for me. I was ready. We could have had the benediction right there. That was so good. I thought, what kind of New Testament question is that? How do you all feel this morning? If I told you how I feel, especially in light of the last 5 minutes, you would question whether I was even a Christian at all. So don't ask me that question. Ask me what I know. Ask me what I know. Don't ask me what I feel about myself. Ask me what I know about God. Ask me what I know about His Word. Ask me what I know to be a verity that can deal with my soul. That's what I need. Don't make me sing songs about how I feel. Don't. The silly, repetitive songs again and again. I just want to praise you, lift my hands and say I love you. You are everything to me. Goodness, at 8:30 on a Sunday morning, I'm barely ambulatory. I can't start there. And you want me to say that? I just kicked the dog, and I don't even have a dog. I got argued with someone because they took my parking space. I never had spilled my coffee. I didn't read my Bible. I'm a miserable wretch. And now you want me to start here. How do you feel? I feel rotten. That's how I feel. What do you got for me? The answer, nothing. I got nothing for you. That's why you have to get yourself under the control of the Scriptures. That's why it is what we know, the verities of the Scriptures, which then fuel our hearts and our emotions and lead us on. Hence, praise my soul, the King of heaven. To His feet thy tribute bring. Ransomed, healed, restored, forgiven. Who like thee his praise should sing? Okay, now we've got something to sing about. For we've been reminded of truth. You've been ransomed. You've been healed. You've been restored. You've been forgiven. You're looking away from yourself. Now you're looking out unto Christ. And it is in this that we have something that fuels our praise.
Several months ago, when I came across that, I became very convicted. You may have noticed over the last 3-4 months that the first thing I don't mention is what a beautiful day it is, or isn't the sun beautiful, or anything like that. But we immediately launch into something that gives our focus on Jesus Christ, and work, or God. And so I really want to challenge you as we gather for worship. It's not about how we feel. To worship God in spirit and truth is about what we know.